this is a bizarre and frankly unsustainable situation, a tension between radical democratic radical democratic, social democratic policies and the worst kind of top-downism, which, as I say, ultimately something has to give. Now, in the Assembly elections in 2007, Labour did very poorly. Now, we would not exclude factors such as health service reconfiguration, which is something I won't get into unless someone asks a specific question. It's not that interesting, but it wasn't that popular either. But leaving that aside, the word on the doorstep was that voters were punishing a non-Blairite administration for the sins of Blairism. It was the war in Iraq, cash for honours. These are the things that voters were concerned about. This suggests, unfortunately, in a way, that voters still think of politics in largely British and not Welsh terms. This might change if a specifically Welsh agenda was pursued more assertively by Welsh Labour. Members might feel more energised and supporters more likely to join if they felt that the party was more inclusive and more responsive and represented a real change from the norm, not just in terms of policies, but how parties and politicians relate to people, relate to their members. I think the same principle applies to the elections of 2008 and the recent Euro elections of 2009. In none of those elections was, for example, the Welsh Health Minister Edwina Hart's attempts, which looked like being successful, to abolish the internal market in health. They were never discussed on the doorstep. A lot of the policies are not apparent, the benefits of them are still bedding in, or they're not reported, or they just don't make good headlines. But what Welsh Labour has to do is break from the etiquette of devolution, which is that you get on with doing your own thing, but you can't openly distance yourself from New Labour. And therefore, I think they might actually keep themselves in a job and save their own political skin, because people will then say, well, hold on, this is something different. This isn't just the same old Labour, the same old Tony Blair, the same old Gordon Brown, the same old politics that we're going to get rid of at the next election. Voting, maybe give that nice Mr Cameron a chance. People might actually make a connection between the fact that their kids don't have to do SATs, that we don't have league tables, that their hospital hasn't become a foundation hospital, it's just a hospital, and the fact that there's people on a Labour ticket actually doing these things, different from what's going on in Westminster. Labour's been in power in one way or another throughout the period of Welsh devolved government, and what happens in Wales depends to a large extent on what happens in the Labour Party. Labour lost an election last week for the first time in Wales since 1918, and so I think that emphasises the fact that what happens in Wales is connected with what happens in the Labour Party. In the book we've examined, hopefully at not too great a length, the internal regime of the party, which, as we say, is characterised by an unattractive combination of old Labour machine politics and new Labour control freakery. If we've learned anything from the events of the 20th century, is that you can't have socialism without democracy, and as I've already said, in the long term, something has to crack in the sort of tension between the healthy political impulse and the internal regime. And what we're hoping for and what we advocate in the book is that the radical impulse of Welsh Labour policies prevail over the conservatism of the apparatus. Now, in the book we've also looked at not only how Welsh Labour relates to its own constituency, we look at how it relates to other parties. Now, proportional representation is a novelty in Wales, but it's been part of the political landscape in other countries for decades. And this makes the issue more pressing. Labour in Wales has to seek out allies with which it can work for real change. The obvious candidate is the other party claiming to be for socialism and equality in Wales, which is Plaid Cymru. Now, the hostility between these parties, which reaches, for those of you who aren't au fait with Welsh political culture, the hostility between these two parties, both of which stand in their manifestos for socialism, social justice and equality, reaches a sort of tribal intensity which acts as an absolute drag, a destructive drag on efforts to bring about a progressive shift in how Wales governs itself. There is a bedrock of hostility towards anything which resembles real or imagined Welsh nationalism, a kind of almost a cringing forelock tugging British unionism, which increasingly mirrors the right wing of the Labour Party, despite the fact that these people talk about we're socialists, we're not nationalists, actually, increasingly, their politics are those of Westminster, of Britain, of New Labour, and their socialism that they claim to stand for isn't really a veneer. What we propose in the book is a longer term and more durable alliance between Labour and Plaid Cymru than the current coalition, which was an arrangement designed to end an electoral stalemate. This doesn't mean abandoning electoral competition between Labour and Plaid. It doesn't mean that we cease to express openly the disagreements that we have, and nor do we advocate the kind of long-term coalitionism which occurs in some other countries, which can bring out the more conservative and right-wing instincts of both parties. What we advocate is a collaboration between the socialists in both parties and with socialists and environmentalists in other parties and of no party, as well as, of course, the trade unions, which we argue are still the greatest repository of, for want of a better term, people power in Wales. Although we argue that realising the full potential of the trade unions involves greater democracy, accountability and responsiveness to the rank and file of its members.